Welcome to our event today on food systems, water rights, and COVID-19 on the Navajo Nation. I am Professor Tarasiano, the director of the Latin American Institute at UCLA, and I have the pleasure of introducing the panelists who will join us for a conversation about Diné's struggles for food sovereignty and environmental justice during this COVID-19 pandemic. The panelists are Janine Yazzie of the Sustainable Development Program. She is the coordinator of the International Indian Treaty Council. And also Nate Etsiti and Felix Earle, Diné farmers and educators. Andrew Curley of the School of Geography, Development and Environment at the University of Arizona, and Shanlin Yazzie and Brandon Benally of St. Michael's, Arizona, the COVID-19 relief effort. The moderator of this panel is Eugenie Clement, a PhD candidate in anthropology at EHESS in Paris. She is the liaison of the Institut des Amériques, UCLA, the Latin American Studies. The Latin American Institute has an agreement with the Institut des Amériques to promote research on the Americas. The Institute is a network of universities in France and the Americas to promote this research. So I am going to introduce Eugenie here, and we'll get this panel going. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, dear Kevin, for this presentation and introduction. I would like to thank first the Latin American Institute and the American Indian Studies Center for hosting this event and co-sponsoring it with the Institut des Amériques. I also want to thank the panelists for their intervention today. They all have really busy schedule, and yet they took the time to be here. So it's a great honor. A recent statement by the United Nations highlights how the COVID-19 pandemic poses a grave health threat to indigenous people around the world who already experience lack of access to essential needs. The situation is no different on the Navajo Nation. As most of you know, COVID-19 has hit very hard the Navajo Nation. Since March, almost 19,000 persons have been tested positive and 700 have died. The Navajo Nation is the largest area retained by indigenous tribe in the United States, with 174,000 inhabitants. Yet it counts only 13 groceries on a territory as big as 5 states of the USA. There is a lack of basic infrastructures: running water, paved roads, electricity, or internet. 30% of households have no electricity nor running water. COVID-19 and adds another layer to these structural inequities, proofs of an ongoing colonialism. In order to understand what is happening and what should be done, we will have 4 interventions tonight. After this intervention, you can ask your question in the Q&R box. And with no further ado, we'll start the first intervention with Andrew Curley, who is an assistant professor of geography at the University of Arizona, a registered member of the Navajo Nation. His research focuses on the everyday incorporation of indigenous nations into colonial economies.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Eugenia. And thank you for our hosts for giving us a space to have this conversation. It's nice to be on a panel with such esteemed panelists, and everybody on this panel following this quick presentation I hope to give have been doing a lot of on-the-ground work, and so I'm going to make my contribution as quick as possible and to try to focus on contextualizing the Navajo Nation. Yeah, this is a title slide, and I just introduced. So let's move on. The Navajo Nation is, as was just said, is a reservation that's the size of many small eastern states, and it is often compared to West Virginia. And it's close to where the hosts of this webinar are located in Los Angeles. In fact, Los Angeles has benefited in many ways from Navajo resources, probably unknowingly, for many years, for decades, in fact. And so the Navajo Nation is located at the intersection of 4 colonial state boundaries, and these are Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, and Colorado, and those are there for reference, so you can see exactly where the Navajo Nation is relative to where you might be. And then in the middle, that's not labeled here, unfortunately, but in the middle of the Navajo Nation is the Hopi Nation, technically called the Hopi tribe, but is actually an indigenous nation that has its own separate government and its own council and its own traditions that are mutually informed, but also different from the Navajo Nation. They are in the center of the reservation, as you can see. Another way to think about the Navajo Nation is through this colonial mapping. And this is basically taking that existing set of boundaries that you see in this map. Sorry, you can't see what I'm pointing at. I keep forgetting we're not in person. My cursor's not working, but anyway, so what you see here in the reservation are what's called executive order lands on top of treaty lands. And this has bearing on what you can do within the Navajo Nation. And this will have impact on how we think about water and how we think about land and how we think about food sovereignty. So the reservation is something that was established initially in the Treaty of 1868. And you can see the Treaty of 1868 in the upper right-hand corner. It's a very very thinly defined boundary, but it's there in the upper right-hand corner of this slide, and that's the original treaty reservation. And since then, there's been executive orders from the President of the United States and in the executive branch expanding onto this initial reservation. But importantly, what happens is that each of these expansions are converting lands. You know, these are lands that indigenous people, both Navajo, Paiute, and Hopi have been living on for many years, centuries, but they're not recognized within the federal system as indigenous lands. And so this form of recognition over time in the 1880s converts all of this land from its aboriginal title to trust land. And trust is a reference to federal Indian law going back to the 1830s that basically says all of this land title is held in the United States government. So what happens is that creates all sorts of barriers. It creates problems for trying to do things within the reservation, trying to build water pipelines, trying to build any kind of basic infrastructure, as I'll show you in a moment. And this is another way of looking at the reservation. This is more contemporary map. And as you'll see, there's different kinds of land statuses outside of the reservation land. So that I was showing you the treaty land and the trust land, but then we even go outside a little bit further and we have a lot of allotment lands. And these are fee simple, held either in trust by the federal government, but allotted to a certain family, or are lands that have been expropriated from the Navajo Nation and held by a private actor. Sometimes it's a railroad company, sometimes it's a uranium developer, which causes all sorts of problems when we're thinking about trying to prevent new forms of contamination. When you have a private held piece of land that a uranium developer has, where that who is claiming that the Navajo Nation has no regulatory authority over them, then that creates all sorts of risks for the community around wherever there might be a potential mine site. So that's something to think about when we're thinking about these statuses of land. Now, all of these land statuses, much of this goes back to the 1930s, the way we're thinking about land in the Navajo Nation. And I use this kind of colorful way of describing it, the long 1930s, but it's basically saying there was a lot that happened in this decade that transformed both the legal status of the Navajo Nation and the political oversight of the Navajo Nation. And the main things that happen are in bullet points on the right, and that's the federal government starts creating grazing districts. And then these grazing districts are basically the entire reservation is divided up into these units that are where there's an approximate amount of animal life that's allowed to live on there and graze on there, and is converted quantitatively into these metrics of units, where one sheep might equal 1 unit and a horse might equal 3 units. And so they're trying to create some sort of currency of grazing between all of these animals in order to calculate it, in order to make this whole land calculable for federal oversight. So this is this colonial apparatus that's overseeing the Navajo Nation. And those grazing districts were carved out, created, and divided up to the tribal membership at the time. And today, those are the grazing districts that still exist and have been subdivided across generations and have created all sorts of not only family infighting, but also inability to develop certain kinds of things on that land. And the panelists might be able to speak on that a little bit more, depending on how their work has interacted with this issue. At the same time, the year after this grazing district starts to be created, the federal government creates the Navajo Nation Council. And this council becomes a governing authority for the reservation. And the council basically makes the laws and decisions of what can happen in the reservation, so long as they're consistent with federal law. And one of the main consistent issues is who holds title to the land. So even though the Navajo Nation makes laws, the Navajo tribal government makes laws, the title is still retained in the federal government. And that creates political difference, colonial difference over time, which I'll show in a moment. And then at the same time, Congress passes the 1937 Indian Mineral Leasing Act, which creates the legal mechanisms necessary for big oil, coal, uranium companies to come into the reservation and to use this land for extractive industries. So there's ways that you can move that land out of these grazing districts really quickly and move it towards mineral interests. It's harder to move these lands out of grazing districts and move it towards sustainable energy, on the other hand. So there's a very clear bias towards what kinds of things you can do on the land based on what kind of existing federal law is out there. So there's a link here to a really interesting podcast that a colleague of mine at UNC Chapel Hill, who's a graduate student there, has put together and is talking about the 1930s, and he's interviewing. It's called Wish Day Podcast, and you can see the link there. And he's interviewing a Navajo student about this particular decade on the Navajo Nation, and they go more into detail about it than what I'm doing here. One thing that I want to focus on now for the rest of this presentation is how does this impact water and water access within the reservation? In the 1960s, Arizona was transforming into the state that it would become today. It was basically moving from cattle and mining to all sorts of different kinds of business development in Phoenix, from military contractors, military bases, semiconductors, electronic manufacturing. All of this stuff was moving into especially into the Phoenix area, and quickly exacerbating existing resources. From 1960 up until 1980, approximately, Arizona is building up its infrastructure, its water infrastructure, particularly to the Salt River Valley where Phoenix is, and into Tucson where I'm currently based. And this is a look at that infrastructure. There's a typo on here. It was just supposed to say 1967, not 1967 too. But this is a Bureau Bureau of Reclamation report that I found in the archives, and this is a map that in 1967 that basically shows you where the infrastructure was being proposed at the time in order to expand Arizona, in order to expand the settler communities in Arizona. And one of the critical ingredients for that expansion was the Navajo generating station. And you can see in the upper center part of the map, there's this thermal power plant proposed. And this is coming in 1967. And what I found in some of my research is that this power plant was proposed in order to get the Central Arizona Project built, which is the aquifer needed, not the aquifer, the aqueduct needed in order to move water from the Colorado River into Phoenix to expand Phoenix's ability to grow. But what was critical for this pipeline, for this aqueduct, was energy and power. And initially, the Department of Interior, the federal government wanted to use dams on the Colorado River on the boundaries of the Grand Canyon National Park, but environmental groups proposed this, and instead they compromised on a coal-fired power plant that would use coal from the Navajo Nation and the Hopi nations in order to power. So basically, the Navajo coal economy was born out of this necessity to get water from the Colorado River into Phoenix. And so we can start to think about imbalances that build up in sacrifice zones that are being constructed. Another interesting note here is that 34,000 acre feet, that's a lot of water. So like 1 acre foot is I think it's approximately 3,000 gallons a year. So so you can think about the quantity of water that we're talking about here. 34,000 acre feet of water was set aside for the construction of the Navajo generating station in order to appease upstream users so that they felt that they would feel confident in CAP being built and it wouldn't be draining the Colorado from its very limited water resources. So basically, what Arizona did was in the lease for NGS in 1969, they included Navajo rights to water, or basically saying the Navajo Nation can't access the water of the Colorado River during the duration of the Navajo generating station until so that this coal-fired power plant can be built. So the Navajo Nation, in other words, was sacrificing, not knowing at this time, but sacrificing its access to water in order to get this coal economy built, in order to get this power infrastructure built, so that water from the Colorado River can get into Phoenix. So going back into the 1960s, the Navajo Nation is putting up a big sacrifice in order for Arizona to develop the way it has. And then when Arizona comes back in the 2010s to talk about water rights and water access, they come at it in a very punitive, aggressive, and limiting way to try to deny as much as possible any kind of water rights to the Navajo Nation from the state of Arizona. And that I'll talk about that in the next slide. So this is something that is, more or less some of the documenting the dialogue that was going on. And I found this article in the archive at Diné College. This was a 1969 Washington Post article saying pretty much what I was saying about how Upper Basin water users were needing to feel satisfied that the CAP wouldn't be taking too much out of the Colorado River. So they put Navajo water rights in its place instead of Arizona water rights. Here are some pictures of in the 1970s, the coal economy being constructed. There's these big cranes coming in. There's these proposed areas where the pipeline, where the rail line was going to be built to move coal from Black Mesa up into the Navajo generating station. But what happens is, but I know I'm going over a lot of stuff. So if you have questions about any of this, we can talk about in a question answer. But what ends up happening is, by the time you get to the 2010s, the Navajo Nation, the lease is about to expire, right? In 2012, 2013, the lease is going to expire in 6 years. So the utilities who own that lease, including LA Water and Power, have to think about whether or not they want to continue in this coal economy. LA Water and Power decides to opt out. Nevada Electric decides to opt out. But the Salt River Project, one of the most important utilities in Arizona, wants to continue this power plant moving forward and wants to continue to use that 34,000 acre feet a year for that purpose, for that power plant, in order to that's initially put into the lease in 1969. And what the Navajo Nation wants instead is they want a water infrastructure on the western end of the reservation. And this is something that has been proposed in 2 water settlements that have been debated and talked about between the Navajo Nation and the state of Arizona in 2010 and again in 2012. And this is the Lower Colorado Basin Settlement and the Little Colorado Basin Settlement, 2010 and 2012 respectively. And these settlements basically would put the infrastructure in place necessary to bring water to the western end of the reservation. But at that time, the senators from Arizona, McCain, as you can see here, and these pictures were taken in Tuba City when they were trying to persuade the Navajo Nation Council to endorse these settlements. McCain and John Kyle were basically telling the Navajo Nation that these projects were too expensive. They couldn't bring them to the Congress and get them funded, and therefore we're just going to have to deal with whatever limited water that they offer, which is anything that continues to go down the Little Colorado River after all of the dams have been put into place, or the existing dams remain set. Like, so none of that water is released and let down into the Navajo. Yeah, am I over time?
Yes, thank you very much, but you are running over your time.
Okay, all right, sorry. Yeah, I had a lot. I'm at the end. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much. I know 15 minutes is never enough. There is so much to say. So thanks a lot. And I'm pretty sure there's gonna be a lot of questions about this topic. So the next panelist is Brandon Benelli. Brandon was raised by strong Navajo women from Black Mesa, Arizona, and Crown Point, New Mexico. Mr. Benelli is Diné, Navajo, and Hopi descent, and volunteers much of his labor outside of his professional work to his family and building a movement to create healthier and dignified lives for all good relatives of the earth. So thank you very much, Brandon.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. Ya'ate. So I'm going to start off with an introduction that might take up most of my time. Unfortunately, Shandi and Yazi won't be able to make it, so I think that gives me enough time to give a Diné introduction. So Ya'ate, She'e Brandon Benali Dasha Diné, Kini Ani Diné Nishlon, Jose Tchachi ni Diné Bashushin, Honagani Diné Dasha Chero Toba Diné Dasha Nella, Kitsili Ado Tistosan Dashkish De Nasha, Diné Hastin Akutego Nishle. My name is Brandon Benali, and I am of the Navajo people born for the Badger clan for the Hopi people. And I'm one of the co-founders of Keh Info Shop, located within the so-called capital of the Navajo Nation, where we've been providing mutual aid and direct support for not only our community, but for the so-called homeless, our unsheltered relatives there as well. So I was going to see if I could share my screen here. So let me do this now. And so what you're seeing here is how the info shop first started. It was, people often ask us, like, how do we get started with a info shop? Often it's just, I often tell people that you don't need an actual building to do it. What we end up doing, we're just getting a pop-up tent and getting some camping grills, some folding tables and folding chairs, and setting that up in a parking lot, along with some books and some radical literature that we had on hand. And we started feeding people from there and started telling people that this is what we're doing now. And so the idea of the info shop started because out of frustrations of not being able to find a space within the Navajo Nation to discuss radical politics, such as anarchism, communism, and socialism, and to directly challenge the political ideologies of our Navajo Nation governance. So with that in mind, through this concept, a universal concept called mutual aid, we began to offer more and more of these services to the unsheltered. and to our community as well. And so when we first started out the mutual aid project, it was simply not just feeding people. I mean, that would be what charities do, right? And we have all heard the motto that charity, not solidarity. And for us, that means not just simply prolonging the illnesses or the symptoms of colonialism, but actively dismantling the structures that keep our unsheltered relatives and the unhealthy states that they're in or find themselves in. And as Andrew pointed out earlier, there's so much that has led us to where we're at now. We didn't choose this, right? We didn't choose to have our waters poisoned, our lands polluted, or our land and air is polluted. We didn't choose to live this way. We didn't choose so-called poverty. We didn't choose to only have 13 grocery stores for a landmass that's slightly larger than the state of West Virginia. We didn't choose all this. And we often talk about contact tracing in regards to COVID-19. And I often tell people, if we're able to do contact tracing on COVID-19, we should be able to do contact tracing on the policies of US imperialism and how they continue to displace, dispossess, and disenfranchise indigenous people, not only within the so-called United States, but globally as well. So with that in mind, when we provide mutual aid, we noticed that one thing that was missing on the Navajo Nation was a treatment center for the unsheltered. So that's one of the larger projects that we had until the pandemic hit. And so when the pandemic hit, I'll be the first to admit that I was afraid to have our collective to go out and provide mutual aid, only because I was concerned about their health. And it would leave it to the younger collective members to change my mind and begin to start putting together care packages. So we started off with we have a food pantry at the info shop, and it took us a year to build it up. And the food pantry is typically used to provide food and other items for families or people in need. And it took us a year. Usually we had a year's worth of food and items to give away. And within 2 weeks, it was gone. As soon as word got out about the curfews that were in place on the Navajo Nation and border towns were closing, that became a huge issue in itself. The border towns are economic centers for the Navajo Nation. They continue to thrive off of the Navajo economy and basically the Navajo crisis and our inabilities to be self-sustaining because of U.S. policies and plans for the indigenous people that Andrew had outlined earlier. So let me share something else here. What we were doing before, so when we started doing mutual aid, we started to get a lot of people coming on to the Navajo Nation saying that a lot of media began to come here and would play up the poverty aspect of why Navajo Nation was hit so hard. But they wouldn't talk about specific US policies that led us to be here in the first place. And so that really fueled our fire to provide mutual aid more. And when we first started mutual aid, we were the only entity within our area of Window-Rock, where the blue dot is, to start providing care packages for people in need. We had set up our website and our social media to start accepting requests. And then this was the service area that we have. And as you can see, we literally traveled hundreds of miles nearly every day to deliver food and water and other critical items to families in need. And then we happened to link up with Diné Nyazi and her partner, Kern, and they give us, being the amazing organizers that they are and the outreach that they have access to, provided us more water, more resources to hand out to people. And we had another friend of ours named Blue Adams who provided us some masks that were made by some 3D printer communities in Utah. And we began to hand that out. So we began to pool our community together. And that's a very fundamental part of what it means to be Diné. You know, we know that this term mutual aid has been co-opted by anarchists, communists, and socialist ideologies. But for us as Diné, specifically as Diné, we refer to this as kinship. That to us is mutual aid. And that to us is a concrete solution on removing ourselves from the effects of capitalism, the effects of imperialism, colonialism, and racism. It's just to maintain good relations with each other. And I don't mean this in a romanticized way. Of course, you know, indigenous societies, just like every other societies globally, are very complex. But underneath that all is this desire to maintain good relations. And you know, the people who don't maintain good relations are our border towns. Specifically, as you can see here in the screenshot, Levi Tapan is the mayor of Farmington, and just how they view indigenous people in a very negative light is very infuriating, especially during times of crisis when when Diné people are being hit so hard, indigenous people are being hit so hard. And then you have a government official from a border town chastising our government for providing aid and chastising us as Diné people for, you know, substance use disorders that they thrive upon, that these border towns thrive upon. So when we began this project of mutual aid, then we linked up with the Navajo and Hopi COVID-19 Relief Fund. And we were also able to get a house. People who haven't been to our info shop don't realize how small it is. So with that house and with the help of at that time, with the COVID Relief Fund group, we were able to get more resources and provide more food and critical items to families in need. And then also with the info shop, with our connections, we were able to provide face shields and face masks to our Zuni and our Hopi relatives. So we didn't just focus on Diné people, providing resources to just Diné families and Diné communities. We had reached out to our other indigenous societies that are relatives to us, that had deep clan kinship systems with us. Like I said, our Hopi and our Pueblo relatives. And that goes back again to this idea of maintaining good relations, because whenever capitalism fails, we always fall back on socialism. We always fall back on anarchism to provide for each other, or communism, socialism to provide for ourselves. And you know, before these terms existed on this hemisphere, we as Diné knew that as Keh. And again, maintaining good relations, not with just ourselves, but with the mountains and the rivers themselves. So these were health workers that we delivered face shields and KN95 masks to within Navajo, Hopi, and Zuni territories. And also we began to provide outreach to other indigenous mutual aid groups within the so-called US, such as the Red Nation, located in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and Tewa Territory, the Indigenous Action Group, or the Indigenous Action Group in so-called Flagstaff, Arizona, and the Northern Navajo Relief Group, the For the People Relief Group. There's so many different mutual aid groups that sprung into action, who not only were organized, but were able to provide mutual aid and relief to our relatives in need. And so I'm often asked, like, you know, what does mutual aid mean to us as Indigenous people? And it's beyond our human to human relationships, but it's also our human to non-human relationships as well, and how we all maintain good relations with each other. And again, like I said, I don't mean this like in a avatar sense, you know, like a mystical native way. You know, there's mutual aid's a very practical and concrete solution to, you know, for all of us, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, to directly slay these monsters that affect us all. And I know I don't mean to tend to ramble a lot, but someone had asked me, as it was in the Red Nation podcast, of what mutual aid meant to me. And the story I gave was that when I was a child, being raised by my grandmothers and my grandfathers in Black Mesa, Arizona, my great grandfather, his name was Bish Baboy. He lived to be 104 years old, and he was an excellent farmer, a very gifted farmer. And so when I'd stay with him during those summers up in Black Mesa, he would load up his very old pickup truck with the produce from his gardens, and he would throw in his old his wooden hand cart, and we would drive to different families that he knew weren't able to farm, or he knew weren't able to provide for themselves. And then he would tell me that we are all given unique gifts and abilities to not only provide for ourselves, but to provide for others. And he told me that that is our way as Diné. We are to use these tools, these gifts that were bestowed upon us to provide for others. And we know that as Keh, and we know that as Keh Hasin, the presence of everlasting kinship and hope. And I know that Nate and Felix could talk more about this, but we as Diné aren't in this dire situation ourselves. We as Diné we are facing the consequences of US imperialism and US policies to deny our abilities to lead self-sustaining lives, to lead healthy and dignified lives. And when we talk about these effects, and we talk about such a thing as land back, and we talk about decolonization and everything else, that doesn't mean that we're asking people to leave. We're reserving the right as indigenous people to use our original systems of kinship to bring in, instead of push people out further and further to these artificial borders, and to realize that we all suffer from the evils of capitalism and imperialism, that we all suffer from colonialism and racism, and that we're in this fight together to slay these monsters. That's it for me for now.
Thank you so much, Brendan, for this testimony and for all the work you do. We will put in the box chat the context of the list of different relief groups. So I've seen the question, and we're going to do that. And next speakers are Nate Etziti and Felix Hurl, Diné permaculture consultants, designer, and educator. Their mission is to empower people so that they may create for themselves sustainable, regenerative, and abundant environments. So the floor is yours.
Yawate, Shay, Nate at City and Chia, Tutsoni, Senjukin Initial, Tutsoni Bashin, Kiani Tashichedo, Kiani Tashanava, without the National, Duj Bitorne Nasha.
Yate, Skados now, so through that Hansangi. Shay, Felix early, Dashajin, Puligini, Dashima, Trabai, Dashaja, although Sanajane Dashache, although Bashajin Dashanel, put I and then Shay, look on Kile Aisi Nasha. Hello, everyone. Yate, thank you for joining us, tuning in. My name is Felix Earl, I am of the Bitterwater clan. Born for the Water's Edge clan. My maternal grandfathers are the Black Streak Running into the Water clan, and my paternal grandfathers are the Black Sheep clan. And I am originally from Ganado, Arizona, on the Navajo Reservation.
And a little background on the work we do. I myself, we both work in food sovereignty. We work alongside a lot of other people. So my background is in permaculture, so-called permaculture, indigenous food systems. And yeah, so I design, I consult, I build, we do it all. And actually, we're so busy right now that we're trying to.
Sorry, we keep looking that way because we have a crew right now working.
And yeah, Felix.
Okay, then. Well, yeah. So like just adding on to what Nathaniel said here. Like Nathaniel, he comes from more of a permaculture background. And then for me, I'm more of a, I like to really focus on indigenous plants, indigenous planting techniques, ancestral techniques, and bringing all those traditional and ancestral techniques and just really just dragging them forward with us, and then kind of just incorporating them within like a more of a modern kind of medium, and always trying to marry those two together, and it's like constantly changing every day for us. So as we, I initially, my family used to be farmers and ranchers back in the 1970s, and then in the mid 1980s, that's when my family kind of just ventured off. That's when like University of New Mexico came into the area. Our parents began to just more focus on the education. And that's when I realized that our family, we kind of just,
Got assimilated.
Yeah, got assimilated. Basically, that's what happened. So, and, but my grandmother, I was raised by my grandmother. So she's always taught or instilled a lot of the traditional and ancestral techniques in me. And yeah, so that's where about 6 years ago, just going off of what I remember as a child out in the cornfields and things like that, I just went ahead and I went ahead and when my grandmother passed in 2012, and what happened is I took over her estate. In her estate, I found in one of her old peyote water pails some seeds and just a dilapidated calico sack. And we separated all the seeds. There were several corn seeds in there, some squash, and we ran germination tests on them. And then the only seeds that germinated were the white, just a handful of white corn seeds germinated. And from there, we just put them in the ground, we planted it there. And then we have what we like to call is Grandma Helen's white corn, Navajo corn.
Very, very drought resistant.
Yeah, so it's a really awesome corn. So that's how I started off. And Nate has always been, Nate kind of actually is the one who really pushed me, nudged me into food sovereignty work. So that's how he told me about a course through Northern Pioneer College here in Arizona. And I just got my paperwork in, and we did the courses, finished it out, within 9 months. And after that, it just snowballs from us after that. So, and then we just been busy ever since.
And so what we're gonna do right now, unfortunately, we have so many cool projects happening at the moment, but I didn't prepare a slideshow of any of that. So we're gonna do our usual presentation that we do as we teach all over the reservation. And it's about our food history here on Navajo. Unfortunately, most people don't know it, and it disappeared. Darn it. I will put, but so where are we at?
So just like what Brandon was speaking of earlier about mutual aid, in a way, Nate and I have become, in a way, we kind of have our own process of providing that. And Nate and I believe we do that through educating people. We initially just don't give things that are tangible to people. We what we like to do is we like to lend our hand to people. We tell them that we have the experience, we have the education, and here's our hand, let us teach you, meet us halfway. And what we like to go by is, how can we help you help yourselves? And that's what that's what I go by doing a lot of my work, is I want to help my people help themselves. So we're always pushing people, pushing people that, you got to get here's our hand, we'll help you out to a certain point, but you are also going to have to help yourselves and also meet us halfway. So in a way, that mutual help that Brandon was speaking of earlier, that's how we like to look at it. And it's so far, it's been really working for us. So like Nate did mention too earlier, what we're going to show you right now, we just barely pulled it up again, is one of the very few presentations that PowerPoints that Nate has put together. Nate's the tech guy. I'm more of the getting my hands dirty in the dirt type of person.
That doesn't mean I don't do anything. Someone's got to think. Someone's got to think. Okay, come on. How do I do this? Okay, here we go. So first of all, what is food sovereignty? Come on.
So we do have the knowledge of how to basically grow food, but what Nate and I really wanted to do is we wanted to include reasons why we should, as people, as humans, grow our own foods. That's why we incorporated a lot of the food history that happened throughout the hundreds of years with the Diné people. So incorporating that information into our presentation actually has helped us a lot. And it's actually quite mind-boggling that how many Navajos or how much Diné people don't actually know about the food history. So go ahead.
So as you can see, food sovereignty was defined by the Declaration and Forum of Food Sovereignty in Mali in 2007 as the right of peoples to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and their right to define their own food and agriculture systems. So this is directly related to everything we do. Like I said, as most of you may know, permaculture is like a collection of all these different techniques from all over the world, indigenous, whether it's European, African, Indian, whatever, but it's just a collection of all these wonderful systems. As the climate and environment is changing, we are having to adapt. And unfortunately, we're having to adapt quicker than we thought. But so here on the reservation, as we were, as highlighted earlier, there are only 13 grocery stores. And in those 13 grocery stores, 80% of the food is considered junk food. It is, it's horrible. So we like to talk about modern day agriculture and how it affects our people with inorganic fertilizers, pesticides, fungicides, herbicides, monocropping, GMO seeds, all these destructive means of growing food are everywhere. And unfortunately, the one huge agriculture project here on the reservation incorporates all of those things, which sucks. So what we focus on is more traditional agriculturally, things that are culturally appropriate, things like crop rotation, diversity, dryland farming, organic farming, naturally adapted seeds, some foraging, and of course, everything is caste-based, family-based, community-based. So in that way, our peoples have survived for millennia. And unfortunately, up until about the 1930s or 50s, our family systems began to dissolve thanks to, capitalism and imperialism. So in the American, or not American, but in our emergence stories, our four sacred foods are corns, beans, squash, and tobacco. There's food for your body and food for your mind. So, and our peoples lived and foraged on wild plants. Every person knew at least 500 different plants for foods and beverages. Nowadays, you can't even, if you were to ask a person to go outside and name at least 3 plants and what their properties are, whether they're medicinal or edible, it's very uncommon. And then we also were very interrelated and interdependent. with other tribes, with their surrounding tribes, our Hopi relatives, our Apache relatives, we've always had extensive trade routes, and unfortunately, well, we're rebuilding. That's the fortunate thing. And so, of course, this brings us to all the governments that have tried to control us as a people, the Spanish monarchy, the Mexican government. Along with these governments came different types of agriculture: peaches, apples, melons, sheep, horses. But at this time in history, we still had complete control over our food systems. So we were still pretty awesome, healthy people. And then along comes the American government. And with the American government came the, what's the word? The campaign. The campaign to control us and round us up and like cattle. And in order to control the people, you control the food. So one of their tactics was the scorched earth tactics. They came and burned and destroyed hundreds of orchards, farms, salted the earth, poisoned wells, and it just goes on and on and on. And then and that's when they created this ration system, and which people are still dependent on. And then you want to?
Okay, then yeah. So, and of course, like we mentioned earlier, so it's education. So what we have here is just the reason, how the U.S. government and other encounters that we had with other races, how that our caste system, basically our caste system was dismantled. So and part of our caste system is our food system. So here we have Huelde. A lot of you might be familiar with this. This is the Long Walk of the Navajo. This is actually the beginning of when our food systems were being destroyed and they were being dismantled from us. So, and that was the only way that that the U.S. government was able to take control of the Diné people and other tribes of North America. So and then the rationing started. So once people lost the ability to grow their own food, hunt, and gather and sustain themselves, the government came in with their food rationing, which still goes on today. It's called the Commodity Food Program on the Navajo Reservation. So, of course, the food that was distributed, the rations that were distributed were foods of very, very low nutritional value. Highly processed. We have flour, we had coffee beans, we had like rancid meats. When even if meat was provided, most of the time it was rancid, lard, things of that nature. So, and then of course, we also like to include the story of our fry bread, our prison bread. That's what Nate and I call it. And it's so amazing to me because a lot of people don't know about fry bread. We all know fry bread is amazing and it tastes awesome and things like that. But we like to include the story of fry bread and how it came about and why it came about. And when we do tell people about the story of how it came to be, a lot of people, it really does have a lot of people think about, the next time they go out, we're not discouraging people to not eat fire bread, but it is, there is a story behind the food. Everything that we consume as humans, especially as Diné people, there is a story behind it. That's how we say it in Navajo. And then also we have sheep, the introduction of domesticated sheep. So my grandma always used to tell me that it's a reintroduction of sheep. She used to say we knew what sheep was way, way before we made contact. And a case in point is because a lot of people did not know that the reintroduction of sheep actually happened in Old Arribi, in Hopi. So they came because...
Felix? Yeah, yes. Can you please conclude the presentation?
Yeah, okay, yeah, sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, we can talk and talk and talk. Okay, well, yeah, so it's just right here, we have the history. So for us, like we said earlier, is education for us.
So we get the Navajo Chapter, and the main possibility, I wanted to show you all what we're doing right now. So right now, we're trying to create even more food systems. And we have a crew, if you can see in the background, working on this hoop house, 100-foot hoop house. And the purpose of the this project is to feed our people, to give them the healthy foods needed to stay healthy and to combat COVID-19. So
yeah, our next venture, perennial growing on the Navajo Reservation in this zone. So that's our next venture that Nate and I are taking on. So yep. So, and we'll keep, if you guys want to just keep up with us, we're both on Facebook, and we post every single day.
Thank you so much. Yeah, we're gonna, I'm sure people will want to have the links to different resources. So we're gonna do that. All right. Thank you so much for this great presentation. And our last speaker is Janine Yassi. She's a Sustainable Development Program Coordinator for the International Indian Treaty Council. And she's also the Council's representative as co-convener of the Indigenous People Major Group of the United Nations High-Level Political Forum on the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. So, thank you, Janine.
Thank you, Eugenie. Hi, everyone. I volunteered to go last, and now I'm really rethinking the wisdom behind that after my colleagues' great presentations. And so I think I'm going to take it back more to the virus and the impacts on our nation, and sort of tie in a lot of the information that was shared from my wonderful colleagues. But, you know, prior to COVID reaching our communities in March, we were already on high alert due to the nature of our community work and all of the things that we were grappling with in terms of the continued threats to our lands, territories, and resources. The reality of Indigenous peoples being on the front lines of the impacts of climate change, and just all of the, basically any type of battle you can talk about, like we're on the front lines of, whether it's endemic poverty, whether it's the legacy of colonization, whether it's grappling with historical trauma and the socioeconomic and cultural impacts that has in our communities. We're talking about like the impacts of water, climate change in the Southwest, the unsustainability of our food systems, the problems and issues with our educational systems, you know, our community organizers were already addressing and holding all of this. So when news about the pandemic and the virus and what it was doing as it spread across Asia and Europe came to the United States, we already knew that our communities would be particularly vulnerable to more moderate and severe forms of the virus should we contract it. And a lot of this, I'm kind of recycling some of the screens that I've, a PowerPoint that I've used before, but for illustration purposes, I think it's important. This is my little doodle because I haven't been able to get like a more professional map made. But the base map is a map of the abandoned uranium mines in our communities. And these are only the areas that are slated for cleanup. So it's not all of them. It does not fully capture the extent of contamination. And in fact, I'm trying to show here through the blue arrows how the movement of contamination through our communities, through our water systems, and through the red arrows, our weather systems, like our wind, rain, snow, and storm systems, and how they move from across our nation. Shows it's really difficult for us to create maps that truly capture the extent of contamination in our communities. And we're talking about contamination from all different forms of extractive industries. The coal, which, you know, was brought to our lands and to our nations through to serve outside agendas, as Andrew covered in his presentation. The uranium, which has a much of a similar history, but was definitely linked to the development of nuclear weapons that were used in World War II, as well as all of the nuclear power tests and nuclear weapons tests that have been done since then. the fracking in Eastern Navajo, represented by the orange squiggly lines that I have on my beautiful map. So like these cumulative industries and the impacts in our communities already created a public health crisis that was present across all of our communities. And so, you know, diabetes, pre-existing conditions in terms of cardiovascular impacts, even things as like asthma in our fracking communities, which has shown an increase in childhood asthma, as well as adult onset asthma. Like all of these things have created the pre-existing conditions that we know make people much more vulnerable, let alone, you know, just the lack of critical community infrastructure, the lack of grocery stores, the fact that we only have 8 hospital units to serve our entire nation. And out of all of those hospital units, only 3 were really outfitted from the beginning to have some of the equipment needed to deal with the respiratory services that is necessary to support people with moderate and extreme forms of COVID. So we were on high alert and also extremely aware of the intersection between energy justice, environmental justice, food justice, water justice, and how all of these issues were going to really create a dire situation for our communities, and also how, because of that, our responses needed to be structured around addressing all of those forms of inequality and those systemic challenges. So when Brandon was talking about the development of mutual aid efforts, you know, I've just by nature of the work in our communities and our history with working with different grassroots organizations across the Navajo Nation, we were really concerned about how do you build the infrastructure in response to something like this, particularly learning from the lessons that we learned from Standing Rock. You know, Standing Rock is a moment in our recent movement history where it's really galvanized and inspired so many people around the world in the importance of fighting for and protecting our water resources. But it's also a battle we largely lost in terms of the pipeline being built and being approved. And now there's been recent court victories that have a lot of potential to reverse a lot of those harmful decisions. But there is a lot of lessons to be learned from the movement building around what took place at Standing Rock. And one of the main things that we wanted to be wary of was that we wanted to ensure that resources that were raised for COVID relief efforts adequately and justly were redistributed and decentralized and sent to support on the ground efforts that existed prior to this pandemic. Unfortunately, that wasn't always the case. And like, this is one of the deeper realities that we're challenged with as a whole, in terms of just how people are so conditioned and so indoctrinated to normalize capitalist practices and responses that actually don't work in our favor when we're trying to build alternative solutions to many of these challenges that we face. And so one of the organizations that I was involved in and actually helped develop ended up treating this pandemic like a business and turning their structure into a business model to respond and bring resources to the communities. And in doing that, really disenfranchised a lot of our volunteers on the ground, a lot of our smaller mutual orgs and mutual aid efforts, and did not redistribute the support that was coming into our nation in a way that could have really changed the power dynamics and could have really helped better resource all of the groups that sprung up around the principles and values of kinship. And I bring this up because it's vitally important to understand how easy it is for our own movements under many of our own leaders to be co-opted and redirect us into these structures and these systems of responses that don't actually lead to our liberation. And as we think about collectively what post-COVID recovery looks like, it's vitally important to learn from these lessons, not only in understanding the complexities around water rights resources and water rights conflicts and how that related to the particularly complex issues around getting critical water infrastructure and drinking water to our communities, but also how the legacy of that continues to create rules that inhibit us from using something like the Federal CARES Act funding in order to address those infrastructure needs. And so, you know, like we really need to be wary of what I've been calling pandemic capitalism, which is the use of CARES Act funding as well as responses for recovery efforts that further embed us in this extractive form of capitalism and this extractive form of an economy, taking us further away from where we need to go at a very critical time in human history. So as a small example of this, tying it back to food systems and food sovereignty and the wonderful presentation and just the lovely work that our relatives Nate and Felix do. We're seeing right now an effort on a large scale, and I see this a lot of this is tied to our work at the United Nations and at the international level. This repackaging of these sort of movements for decentralized, more diverse, place-based agricultural systems that are more in line with the way indigenous peoples have supported food sovereignty for millennia. And like having bits and pieces of those practices sort of extracted from our communities and repackaged under labels like regenerative ag, and then sold back or being retrained or retaught back to our peoples in ways that are very harmful and that actually don't capture the full scale of the type of shifts that are needed in our food systems to really support long-term sustainability and climate resiliency, as well as food justice and what it means to create more equality around the production and distribution of food. And so like the threats are there. I wasn't keeping track of my time. Eugenie, how many more minutes do I have?
You have 5 minutes more left. So you're good. You can go.
Okay. I'm trying to tie all of this into a very, very concrete sort of analysis. It's just not very easy most times because there's so much history behind this. Like Brandon said, it's been really disheartening to see a lot of the publicity around the impacts of COVID in our communities really center around the continued narrative of poverty porn and just like, oh, these poor natives, they're so poor and they just can't help themselves. They need us to come in and save them. And the reality is that we need people to help support us in dismantling and deconstructing these imperialist systems and these colonial systems that continue to impose rules and structures of authority that take our people's power away. And we've done our best with the journalists that have come to sort of give them that history, but because it's so lengthy, because it's so complex, it invariably always gets bottom lined and is centralized to a more simpler narrative that loses all of the importance of those nuances and that lived experience that needs to inform how we go forward and what our responsibilities are, what everyone's responsibilities are as American citizens, particularly if they reside in the Southwest United States, to be part of restorative justice, to be part of and understand like the importance of land back movements, to understand what their states and what individual private landowners are doing to enforce these rules on our peoples, to the detriment of not only our nations, but to the detriment of building real alternative solutions to corporate capitalism that can benefit everybody. And like that's one of the most important things to underscore. Indigenous people's rights are important because they're human rights, but they're also collective rights. They are the framework and the example, the model for how we can reimagine building collective power and restoring collective power that is responsive to and accountable to maintaining sustainability and balance with all life forms. With what we're grappling with now and the link between COVID-19 and climate change impacts and the loss of biological diversity and animal habitat gets lost in all of the politics around, do we wear masks or not? Do restaurants reopen or not? Like, what about the economy? When really we're not talking about the benefits to the people on the ground, to everyday citizens. We're really being entrapped in a narrative and a continued discussion that really only benefits those who monopolize wealth, resources, and who want to maintain a status quo that does not threaten the power that they've built through colonization, through widespread human rights abuses, and through the theft of Indigenous people's lands, territories, and resources. And we need to shift that. We all have a responsibility to shift that narrative and to focus on what's important. And I think that that's where the real power comes in, is that up until COVID, we were told widespread behavioral change is impossible. We were told it would be impossible to shift people's consumption habits and behaviors. And I think one of the biggest lessons we learned from COVID-19 is that it's not. Not only is it possible to shift on a global scale many of our harmful practices, but it's also possible to restore local efforts to build better social nets and to build better community networks that center kinship, that center our responsibility to each other, and that take care of our most vulnerable, regardless of how the states and the governments react or respond or don't respond. We have that power, and I really hope that we can take these lessons forward and really transform what we imagine movement building to be, and how we manifest that, to not be continually co-opted and caught into this reactionary position to imperialism, but actually build, just completely dismantle those systems and build the alternatives that all of our peoples need.
Thank you so much. That was such a powerful speech in 15 minutes, and a beautiful way to end these presentations. So with the questions, there's a question from Pamela G. Peters about pandemic capitalism. And if Janine, if you have any more information to share, if you have like web link to provide or articles, like much information, that would be lovely. That's one of the questions.
Yes, I'll be happy to share some of the information I've been using. I literally just started, I made up this term. I'm sure someone else has also made up this term at some point, like just the way our human consciousness is connected and works. But yes, I've been trying to put together some of the resources and experiences that we've had around what this has been looking like for Navajo in particular, but also with the opportunities that I have with working and seeing and hearing about the impacts to Indigenous peoples elsewhere, how this is playing out in those territories as well.
All right. Thank you very much. There is also a question for all of the panelists by Cristina Chica. It was, well, first for Brendan, but a question to all panelists. Could you please share some key reading, listening, other media suggestion for your peoples or other Indigenous people epistemologies that you admire for us listening to read or learn from? So Brendan shared already some links, but if each of you can share like some, that would be great.
The one thing I can suggest is the Diné College, what is it called? The Food Sovereignty Report. It's a very informative, so I will try to find a link to it.
I added a link into the chat to International Indian Treaty Council's webpage and website. There's so much good materials there. I mean, one of the things I love about this organization is how transparent and accountable they are to the Indigenous peoples we represent as affiliates, but also Indigenous peoples as a whole. So every report that they've done in terms of investigating some of the impacts of COVID-19, they've also hosted webinars on food sovereignty as it related to the pandemic. They were actually International Indian Treaty Council is the international arm that was developed out of the American Indian movement. And they really went beyond and played a pivotal part in the development of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, in the coining of food sovereignty and what it means, and the development of networks and declarations that restore our traditional trade networks that kept all of our nations sustainable for eons. So it's really there. It's all available on their website under the different streams of work and the news and updates. They also have a report that they did on the impacts of COVID in North America in particular. So I just strongly encourage people to peruse the website at their leisure.
I have a couple of books that are right by me that I've been reading. One is called The Southwest Under Stress, written by, it's a study by Johns Hopkins University. The other is Black Mesa, The Angel of Death, written by Gordon and Copeland, which gives more history on the struggles of Black Mesa, Big Mountain resistance for Diné people. Red Power Rising, to give you more of a thorough background on the so-called Red Power movement within indigenous nations. And also, it's really hard to to find good books that were written by indigenous people. I don't have it right by me right now, but there's one called Our History is the Future by Dr. Nick Estes. And just to do a little bit of promotion, there's another book coming out in February called Border Town Violence, that was written by the Border Town Violence Committee, that includes Dr. Nick Estes, Dr. Melanie Yazzie, Dr. Jennifer Dinette-Dell, Dr. David Correa, and the foreword of which was written by myself and my partner, Red Millicody. So that's a start, but I also provided website links to Eugenie.
Yes, I've shared them. Thank you. Andrew, do you have any suggestion you would like to share? I know you've got some.
Yeah, there's a lot. It depends on what kind of reading you want to do. Some of them are more historical in nature. Some of them are more technical. I think some of the readings one of the readings that Brandon offered, Angel of Death, that one is a little bit old and out of print, so it might be hard to find depending on what library you're looking at. There's if you're looking at Diné energy issues, I think that there's two books that I rely on a lot, and that's the Power Lines book by Andrew Needham. He's a historian, and he does more of the historical development of energy infrastructure in Arizona and the Southwest, and has a big component on the Navajo Nation and Navajo nationalism. And then there's also my colleague Dana Powell, who's an anthropologist, whose book is called Landscapes of Power, and hers was an ethnography and was looking at the complicated ways that people were talking about energy and development in around 2008 with a proposed power plant on the eastern end of the Navajo Nation. It was called the Desert Rock Power Plant. It never was built, but there was all of the conversations we're having about coal and energy today were somewhat similar at that time. They were different, but there were some similarities behind them. Yeah, and then on water, I mean, there's a lot of the water stuff is older, so I'm trying to actually write and publish more on water in a way that's less technical and jargony. So, but there's not really a lot of good useful things to grab onto right now, except for like maybe some of the activist literature that other people know.
All right, thank you very much. Nathan, Felix, do you have any reading or media suggestion you would like to add to the list? You have to unmute yourself. You're mute.
Oh yeah, yeah. Oh, most of what I read is mainstream permaculture. So unfortunately, I haven't written my own book yet. So things like Gaia's Garden by Toby Hemingway is awesome. All the Brad Lancaster's water harvesting books, manuals are awesome.
Food sovereignty, the Navajo way. Food sovereignty, the Navajo way, cooking with tall women.
Gosh, yeah, and actually just peruse Google. You know, don't buy it, just liberate it. Anyway, yeah.
Yeah, that's what I have to top of my head off. I was trying to think of that.
All right, thank you so much.
Just add to that. I think it's very important. Yeah, we're living in the age of information, right? The era of technology. And I think that having more access to information also comes with more responsibility. So I'm always asking people that as you use those tools, like be specific and looking for indigenous authors and indigenous experts. We have indigenous experts and have indigenous experts in every field you can imagine, from working with NASA and our public health systems to addressing water resources and building broadband. And all of them really bring that cultural perspective and that framework that is unique to indigenous peoples to how they engage in these projects and these problems. And I think that looking for that and being diligent and reading between the lines, because there's a lot of things that are mainstream that aren't written by indigenous peoples, and they may be helpful and can help sort of bridge the communication gap in some ways, but still augment that reading, augment those resources with things that are actually written by our own experts.
Yeah, and
I'm sorry.
I was just going to respond quickly to what Janine was saying. I think like if you see anything that's on a really mainstream press, like Rawman or something, and it's Roman, I forget how you call it, Roman and Littlefield, like any of these main books like that are published by non-natives that are like using a lot of cultural stereotyping, you know, like Navajo's wearing Nike, I think might be one of them, or, you know, like it's just like this very primitivist looking text, and there's a lot of those popular things out there. And histories are really bad, like Blood and Thunder is one I really hate. Is that what's called? Blood? The Hampton Sides book? Really hate that book. So don't ever buy it.
I was going to say,
maybe we should do like a list of like books not to buy.
It would be easier.
Yeah, it'd be a lot easier.
So in our work, most of our information is orally transmitted. So we go out and we actually don't act. So we take down the whole teacher audience system, and we open a dialogue with our communities. And as we're talking about all our information, as we're teaching, we tell people, interrupt us, you know, tell us your memories, you know. So something will trigger in our people when they hear a story or we're talking about a food, and then will come this pouring of information. And what we do, what our job is to do, is to take that information, synthesize it, and then give it back out again. So most of our knowledge, our cultural Diné knowledge, is not written. It's all, you know, taught communally. And I probably won't write it down.
We end up being the students most of the time.
Yeah.
Yeah,
No, that's a very important point. And I know we're getting other questions, but I just wanted to add on to this. A lot of times, especially in Western systems of knowledge, oral history is seen as sort of a primitive form of knowledge and of knowledge transference, right? And there's a lot of reasons behind that from the Western lens. But the reality is that Indigenous education systems are Indigenous understandings of how knowledge is created and for what purposes it's created for, and the process behind it is much more complex. And that's why so many of our peoples relied on oral histories, because knowledge, it was understood as a sacred thing. It's a responsibility of both the knowledge holder and the ones that are listening to co-create. It's place-based. It's based on different factors of a lived moment, a lived experience. And it's also understood that people absorb and understand knowledge differently at different parts of and stages of their life and in different contexts. And I think a lot of that understanding of how knowledge is co-created is really important, because really what we're fighting against when we're talking about Western structures and Western institutions of power and of solutions is also a mindset of what is a legitimate solution, what are legitimate forms of experience, what are legitimate blah, 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 that our peoples cannot fit in. And that's why you see this extraction happening, even when it comes to knowledge, our traditional ecological practices, which is right now becoming one of the big buzzwords in the field of sustainability, that is harmful as well. Because if we were to write down, for example, everything we know about food systems, we are then contributing to the death of the evolution of that consciousness and the need to respect our food systems as living and evolving things. And that type of prescriptive approach to solutions is actually not what we need right now. What we need is more respect and adherence to the sacredness of how knowledge needs to be built, and the diversity of viewpoints and epistemologies and knowledge systems and practices that reflects the biodiversity of our natural ecosystems, as a pathway forward and out of all of these ways that corporate capitalism and these systems of imperialism have indoctrinated all of our peoples, both within the US and outside the US. There is a different way. There is a different possibility and a different way to imagine our collective future. But we really have to get down to these roots of deconstructing all the ways that we're taught that isn't so. I just finished reading the Jakarta method, and one of the things I want to say in that about that as well is that there's a whole history in how the fight against communism and socialism globally was very much connected to the threat that Indigenous peoples pose to these systems of power. And part of the surveillance state and the campaigns and the studies that were taken to be able to anticipate how to kill movements before they even begun was largely started in Indigenous peoples' communities and among Indigenous nations. And so understanding that, I think, can help people better understand why our narratives are so rendered so invisible with mainstream media, and why we're still such a threat, why human rights defenders, land rights defenders, and Indigenous peoples are still disproportionately killed by state apparatuses here in the US and around the world. And I think that that's a critical part of the American consciousness that needs to be built.
All right, thank you very much for this different suggestion. We also have a question from Angela about the book Braiding Sweet Grass. Is it on the list of books to read or not to read? Have you read it? I haven't personally.
Sorry, haven't read it yet. So.
Oh, I haven't read it yet myself. I think we might have it at the info shop, but I haven't read it.
You read it, Andrew?
Yeah, I'm halfway through it actually, but I like what I've read so far.
Yeah, I have it, and I just started, and I'm really excited about it. And the feedback that we've gotten from people that are really respected in this field, really loving it as well. So I think that's one of the good ones.
Yeah, definitely.
All right, thank you very much. We have a question also from Kevin. Is there hope now that there is a new administration coming in with people who have more respect for the EPA and have a plan to address COVID, or does it matter? Hey.
Can I go first on this? So was it just recently announced that Thomas Udall is Secretary of Interior? So I mean, nothing against Udall, but what I think is interesting about this example of the Udalls is that, you know, they're probably the most progressive, environmental, liberal side of democratic politics you can get within the Democratic Party, and they are, or at least Stuart Udall, who was a former Secretary of Interior, is largely responsible for the Navajo coal economy. You know, the origin of it, not how it played out, but how it was established, which then created the conditions for CAP and all of this political colonial difference over time between the state of Arizona and the Navajo Nation. It created the conditions that we live in today. You know, even if it was well-meaning, right? Like well-meaning in the mid-60s to say, we're going to build this coal mine, we're going to build this power plant to give people jobs, give revenues, to bring the Navajo Nation into some sort of modernization and development, and all of these tropes that were popular at the time. Even if that were the case, like the long-term impacts of that, that's what we're dealing with today, 50 years later. So all of this well-meaning liberalism often comes with all of these like understood consequences, and that when they're built on political difference that's rooted in colonial difference, a political difference rooted in colonial difference, that means alienation of trust, alienation of Aboriginal title, alienation of indigenous water rights, alienation of our ecological practices, our political practices. Like if you build a policy and a program off of that, you continue to perpetuate it, that colonial difference over time. So that's some of the, you know, when you see indigenous people be cynical about the parties in play, it's not to say that we don't understand the differences between the two, but that we understand the larger historical structures that are containing us, that both parties adhere to.
All right, who wants to go next on that question? Janine, you've got some, what is your opinion on this?
I didn't want to be put on the spot because I think Andrew's question answer was really beautiful. But I just want to further emphasize, like, these threats and all the things that we laid out for everyone happened no matter who was in power, right? Whether it was Republican or Democrat. And a lot of times, even when we had our own indigenous representatives put into positions of decision-making power, these practices perpetuate itself because if you're not fundamentally taking responsibility for how these institutions of power built themselves up on the thefts of our lands, territories, and resources, the exploitation of our communities and our peoples, then you're just putting a band-aid and calling it reform while not really addressing the true legacy and the true roots of this inequality and in this injustice that we're facing. And I think that, you know, there's a lot of hope and also a lot of potential and diversity of tactics. I'm not trying to discourage people from, like, you know, continuing to do their work to get out the native vote and whatnot, but we saw what happened with this last election. So many people already capitulated to the Democratic Party and the blue no matter who sort of talking point, our principle and rallying call, that they drove out people in unprecedented numbers to support this transition and support a new administration. And now that they're not having their voice listened to at any level of decision making when it comes to this transition that's in place, and when it comes to the 100-day priority of this administration. The only way that I've been able to get involved in these conversations is through non-Native organizations and coalition groups that I know did not do nearly as much as these Native-led voter drive and voter organization groups did. And so I think, like, that in itself is infuriating, but it wasn't unexpected because of these issues and these patterns and the reality behind these governance structures and what they were set up to do. It's also important to know that it's not just EPA we got to be worried about. Like the department, we are the only minority in the United States that is still governed largely under the Department of the Interior, which was formerly the Department of War. And the large majority of the control and the manipulation of our tribal governments and what they can and cannot do and how that impacts in our expression of sovereignty is still under that branch. And that's I think that's one of the biggest injustices of what we're dealing with and what we're challenged by, because right now there's so many people that's upset with our Navajo Nation for how they handled the CARES Act funding. But the reality is, like, unless you really understood how our Navajo Nation government was structured, how the 3-branch system works, and how much the federal government dictates what we can and cannot do with federal resources, you're going to continue to blame our own people for situations and challenges and failures that we did not architect. Like we did not create these things. And so I really feel for our tribal leaders, even though I do share some of the disappointment, because this should have been a time for us to assert that we're going to do this our way, and we're going to use these resources in the way that best benefits our people and redistribute that and invest that in the people on the ground who are doing mutual aid efforts, who've been doing food sovereignty work, who've been working for water justice. But that's not how these systems are structured to support that type of self-sufficiency. And so I think that we have a big battle ahead of us, even though we're transitioning to the Biden-Harris administration. And I'm really hoping that just because we're transitioning to an administration that's not Trump, that we don't let another wave of apathy take over and silence all these new allies we had under Trump, because white supremacy is still going to be an issue. It's still there. The margins that they won were not big enough for us to like go back to our comfort zone, and for us to think that Trump is no longer going to be a threat as we move forward. White supremacy is no longer going to be a threat. So we have a lot of work to do.
And I could jump onto that. I mean, Andrew and Janine gave really great answers. It seems like some of the most harmful effects towards Indigenous people have been written by Republicans and by Democrats. And Indigenous people have a unique relationship and understanding with that. I mean, we could look at Standing Rock again, which really galvanized this modern Red Power movement. Who was president during Standing Rock, right? Barack Obama, the savior of the Democratic Party, it seems to be these days. And we look at a lot of different policies that were written towards Diné people, Hopi people, other Indigenous people. It seems that these appeals to power, these appeals to white supremacist structures are, and as Jeannie said, I do believe in a diversity of tactics, but it seems we're losing more and more every day. And no matter who's in power. And as long as the consciousness of Indigenous and non-Indigenous people on this continent is to aspire to be what old, rich white men are, then we're never going to leave that consciousness, that ability to think that we can vote someone in who will have the best interests for us. Whoever we vote in is just a reflection of the subconsciousness, the common sense of the American populace that was already there. Like I wasn't surprised that Trump won, because there was an undercurrent of white supremacy that was waiting, that was there, that had always been there. And I wasn't surprised that he almost won again, because that undercurrent still exists. And as long as that undercurrent exists of white supremacy, of colonization, then it doesn't matter who is elected into these positions or placed into these positions. From an Indigenous perspective, we're always going to lose, even if we play by their games. And even when we start winning in their games, they start to change the rules. So again, as Janine and Andrew and others have said, we have to start imagining, as Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, healthier ways of living. And it may seem impossible now, and then I have to go back to our Black feminist scholars and our trans Black scholars and activists who say, like, at one point, racism was seen as something that was impossible to address, that segregation was impossible to address, that slavery was impossible to address. And we have victory upon victory upon victory in our past, where we were able to defeat the impossible monsters that existed among us. And this is the latest one. US imperialism and capitalism is is like one of the final boss stages of monsters that we have to slay together, and it's going to require all of us to do that. So we're not pessimists, we're more realists as Indigenous people who live directly under the consequences of policies that affect us, that are written by Democrats and Republicans. So as Janine and Andrew and others have said, like we can't let up, we can't let our guard down and think that we have any breathing room. I tend to see Democrats as more insidious than Republicans. Like Republicans are right in your face. Like, I know I don't like you. I know you don't like me. And the Democrats are more insidious in that their goal is to maintain the status quo. And it's a lot harder to find out who's a real accomplice and who's a real ally in those situations.
And so personally, I always say, I feel personally that we need to turn our attentions towards corporations and bring those down to make actual change. So anyway, that's my 2 cents.
All right.
Thank you so much.
All right, we've got a question from Edith. You mentioned the part played by your grandmothers and grandfathers in who you are today. I think it's about Brandon, a question for Brandon. Can you elaborate a little bit about transmission of the history of your Diné Nation today? And Janine, can you share a little bit about what led you to where you are now? Ooh.
Our origin stories. Well, I want to preface this by saying I am in an immense position of privilege. A statistic I like to say is that 70% of Indigenous people don't live within a so-called reservation. 70% of Indigenous people live in urban areas. And so, and the reason why I say that is because sometimes a lot of Indigenous epistemology or activism is based on land back, and which is important. It definitely is, but 70% of these people don't have that option. They don't often have the option to return home and to do what a lot of us are privileged to do and to learn from. And that privilege goes deeper into, I was raised, superficially, my family background may look like a cheesy Indigenous film, right? Like alcoholic family, grew up on the low rent poverty line of the Indigenous territories. But at the same time, I had access to people who were rich in cultural knowledge and traditions of what it means to be Diné. So I really hate like comparing as though my experience is how everyone's experience is. I'm in a very small minority of people who were able to be raised in an urban environment, but to also have a strong connection to the land, our language, and our lifeways as Diné people. In fact, I often say it's like a bubble, because within that small bubble of cultural knowledge and traditions, I was taught about the false the false binary of male and female genders. I was taught about the multiple genders and how we ourselves as Diné people are gender fluid. I was taught about, much more deeper understandings of kinship and ceremony and everything else, but that only existed within that small culture, that small subgroup that I was part of in Black Mesa. So my experience can't be spoken for all, even those who grew up within the so-called reservation and grew up with other traditional teachings. So with me, for my specific example, it was just my grandfather, my great-grandfather, and my aunties and grandmas just providing example of what it means to be, for me, to what it means, what my responsibilities are as Diné. So, to me, I really wish that I could discuss this more with other Diné people, but again, I always have to put that out there that my experience is, in my personal opinion, sadly unique to myself, and that I'm extremely privileged to have grown up within the language and to be surrounded by that.
Thank you so much for this testimony. Okay, we have less than 10 minutes left. So Janine, could you please answer? And then we have a last question from Andreas, and we're gonna finish. So I'll give you the space.
So way back in the day, 3 generations ago, I was kidding. You know what? I am extremely privileged to be on the path that I'm on, and I fought very hard to create my own path because of my experience growing up and being a survivor of childhood sexual abuse, of growing up in a home with domestic violence, of being in a community where I was losing friends and relatives left and right, to addictions, to gang violence. I saw that all of the traditional pathways that were set for us really weren't made for us. Like, it was in school that teachers would tell us we would not amount to anything. It was in school that our teachers would kind of tell us like we were dirty Indians, or we're from a savage primitive race, and the more white we'd act, the more possibility we'd have for success. And like, this isn't that long ago, you know, like, and so I think that was very critical in my development, even though I still almost became a statistic when I was in high school. I was very suicidal, I was very depressed. It still helped me understand, when I was able to regain like my sense of power and sense of control, that I didn't have to follow these pathways that were laid for me, that I could fight for a different way. And I wanted to, because I could not reconcile with just what I went through and where I wanted to go, and my commitment to going back home, moving back here to help my families and to help my communities. I couldn't reconcile that the only pathway for me to do that was a pathway that eliminated my friends, my family, my community from success, through all of these different barriers that were put up. And so a lot of, even though I ended up going to Barnard College of Columbia University and meeting my husband there, my real education didn't happen until I returned home and started working with my comrades that maybe did not have the same experiences or opportunities as I did to move off and experience different things. And they helped me sort of unlearn a lot of really harmful lessons and relearn what it means to be Diné, like what it means to be a human being with a responsibility to take all of our gifts and our powers to be part of a community that's much larger than us, that much larger than just our human family. And I think fighting for that, and also sticking to those values and to those morals that are handed down from our grandparents. In particular, my grandma only had a second grade education. She was protected and insulated from the boarding school experience. And she was a true leader. She never had any title. No one would ever say that she was a leader of our community, but she single-handedly took care of and raised so many people in our community, fed them when she had nothing. And she taught me that being a leader is taking care of those around you and expecting nothing in return, not notoriety, not popularity, and not a title. So when I see like how our movements can be co-opted by this sort of like really corrupt and problematic view of leadership, our warriorism in a lot of places, it helps to hold myself accountable by falling back on those lessons by our elders who have worked and fought for so many generations with little to no support, little to no recognition. But because of them, we're able to stand on the shoulders and the work that they've done to continue to dream and vision and have hope for an alternative future. And I think that that's my role now as a elder millennial, to start to learn from those examples and start to pass that down to our future generations.
All right, thank you very much. And the last question, if you can give a quick answer to such a topic. So the question from Andreas is, are Navajo and or OP languages in decline in terms of how many fluent speakers there are?
We've actually created an AI Diné and Navajo robot that's like consuming all the language. No, I'm just kidding. I don't mean to be so flippant with the answer, but I can say that there's hope in preserving a lot of it from a Diné perspective. And I can't speak for a Hopi perspective, even though I am born for Hopi. But I do know there are interesting language revitalization products. More medicine people, traditional people are more open to the idea of technology storing these, using technology to not only teach the language, but to store certain songs and even ceremonies, even like they're accepting that this is the way it is now, this is the way it's going to be. So I see a lot more younger medicine people who are more receptive to the idea, whereas in the past, just simply even recording it or drawing anything from a ceremony or song was strictly prohibited. But now they're seeing where it could go if we don't. So I see that technology is being more and more embraced within certain traditional and medicine people.
I'll just add on to that. I can't speak for Hopi and the state of their language systems. I know this is a problem across all Indigenous peoples, and it's not unrelated, right? It's not unrelated to anything we're talking about. Like the current status of the lack of language speakers is very much tied to the history of colonization, of indoctrination into assimilative policies, and was a concerted effort to disconnect us from our life ways, from our connection to land, and our value systems over generations. So preserving and restoring language is definitely a core part of our liberation and the revitalization of the sustainability and sovereignty of our peoples. But how to do it is also goes back to what I was saying earlier about education. You know, like right now, having our language sort of codified and structured along a Western linguistic framework is shifting things a little bit. It's ignoring the uniqueness of dialect across the different regions of our Navajo Nation. It's ignoring the fact that language is a living thing.